Chapter 1. Before the door opens. The tea had to steep for exactly 4 minutes, not 3 minutes and 50 seconds, and not 4 minutes and 10. Miren had learned this the way she'd learned most things, through careful observation and a willingness to start over when she got it wrong. The leaves, a blend of Assam and something that grew only on the eastern cliffs, something that had no name in any catalog she'd found, needed time to surrender themselves properly. Rush them, and you got something bitter and thin. Forget them, and you got something stewed and regretful. 4 minutes, and then done. She watched the sand in the small glass timer trickle through its narrow waist. Dawn came gray and soft through the cottage kitchen window, the harbor a quiet pewter below. This early, the fishing boats were already out. She could see their lights moving slow and purposeful beyond the harbor mouth, but the town itself was still dreaming. Cobblestones, dark with last night's dew. Gulls not yet arguing. The lighthouse beam still sweeping its long, patient arc across the water, though it would fade when the sun rose high enough to make it feel unnecessary. Miren hummed. She didn't notice she was doing it. The sound rose and fell with no particular melody, just the natural vibration of a person occupying silence, filling it with something so habitual it had become invisible to her. When the timer ran its course, she lifted the strainer without breaking the rhythm, set it on the folded cloth she kept exactly here for that purpose, and poured the tea into her mug. A plain white mug, reliable and unchipped, unmarked except for a faint shadow of use around the rim. She had others in the cupboard. She always used this one. She did not sit down. This, too, was habit, and not, she suspected, a healthy one, though she never examined it too directly. Her knees had opinions about standing at 50, and the opinions were increasingly pointed on cool September mornings. But the kitchen table had one chair, and sitting in it felt like a commitment to the stillness she was trying not to examine. So she stood at the window instead and drank her tea while the harbor town slowly gathered its colors back from the dark. The kitchen was immaculate, not in the way of disuse, but in the way of someone who tidied as she thought, who could not properly consider a problem with disorder in her peripheral vision. The herbs along the back shelf were organized by property rather than alphabetically. Sympathy blends together, clarity blends together, protection to the left where they caught the morning light. And she'd reorganized them twice this week already, which was twice more than was necessary and which she recognized, dimly, as a symptom of something she preferred not to name directly. On the counter, one plate waiting in the dish rack, one mug now warm in her hands, one clean knife beside the cutting board aligned parallel to the counter's edge. In the cupboard above, if she opened it, she would find enough space for guests she never had. On the small bookshelf in the corner, everything was alphabetized. Fiction by author, reference by subject, and tucked behind the larger volumes. 3 novels with faded spines she'd read so many times the pages had gone soft at the corners. Novels she'd never have admitted to owning to anyone who asked. The sort of novels where people found each other against considerable odds, where the finding felt inevitable in the way that real things rarely did. She was 50 years old. She drank her tea standing up and looked at the harbor and thought that she was, all things considered, content. Content was a word she'd chosen carefully, like choosing herbs for a blend. Not happy. Happy was too large and too uncertain, the kind of word that invited comparison. Not lonely. Lonely implied wanting something different. And she'd made her peace with the arrangement of her life a long time ago, in her late 30s. after a heartbreak that had taken several years to properly process and left behind it a useful kind of clarity. She knew who she was. She knew what she was good at. She had work she believed in, a cottage she loved, a view of the sea that never quite repeated itself. Content. The word sat in her chest like a warm stone. She rinsed her mug and set it in the dish rack. The motion was precise and unhurried. She dried her hands on the kitchen cloth and looked at the clock on the wall, and she told herself she had enough time to eat something before walking down to the shop, and then realized she wasn't hungry and that this, too, was probably a symptom. Today was the opening day of her tea shop. She looked at the harbor through the window, the mist still moving in slow tendrils between the dock buildings. The maple at the end of the lane, with its edges just beginning to confess to amber, the lighthouse beam completing one more long sweep before the risen sun made it unnecessary. And she thought about that in the neutral, careful way she thought about things that unsettled her. The shop was ready, had been ready for 3 weeks, technically. The shelves were stocked, the tables arranged in what she hoped was an inviting configuration. The old wood floor refinished to a warm honey color. She'd spent a considerable portion of one afternoon placing teacups in small groupings that looked, she hoped, friendly rather than staged. She'd stood back and evaluated them and moved several by increments so small no one would ever notice them. The shop was ready. She was the thing that wasn't. What, precisely, was she afraid of? She'd asked herself this question several times this week, always in the same practical way, as though it were a problem with a solution she simply hadn't located yet. She was a sorceress of some 20 years' professional experience. She'd brewed remedies for broken limbs and broken engagements. She'd negotiated with a territorial sea charm haunting the harbor mouth for 3 seasons and sent it peacefully on its way. She had, on one memorable occasion, talked down a waterspout menacing a fishing vessel using nothing but a flask of cedar oil and considerable nerve. She was afraid of a tea shop, of opening a door and letting people in. Of being seen came the quieter answer, the one she didn't quite let herself hear clearly. She picked up her basket, keys, spare apron, a small parcel of the Eastern Cliff blend she'd prepared that morning more carefully than was strictly necessary, and she put on her coat and walked out into the September morning. The walk into town took 11 minutes by the lower path that ran along the harbor edge. She'd counted once in the early weeks of living here before the number became irrelevant, and she simply knew it the way she knew the feel of her own front step in the dark. The cobblestones were still slick with dew, and she walked carefully, her old boots negotiating the uneven stones with the authority of long familiarity. Salt air and the smell of cold water and, from somewhere she couldn't quite place, the good yeasty warmth of bread baking early. A net mender at the end of the second dock raised a hand without looking up. She raised one back. A gull made a single interrogative sound directly above her head, apparently having business with the situation, and then thought better of it and wheeled away toward the water. A small child in a yellow coat appeared at a corner, regarded her with the complete seriousness only children and cats can sustain, and then vanished around a doorframe. This was the town she'd chosen 17 years ago, when she was 33 and looking for somewhere to practice her trade without having to explain herself at every turn. A harbor town with magic already woven into its bones, wind chimes that anticipated weather, fishing nets that mended themselves on calm nights, the harbor water that repelled severe storms through some agreement it had made with the sea long before anyone currently living had been born. A town that treated the magical as mundane, and the mundane as worth attending to. She'd arrived for 3 months and never quite gotten around to leaving. The tea shop occupied the corner of Wavern Lane and the small cobbled square where an old carved stone basin had caught rainwater for longer than anyone's memory extended. The building was old, thick walls and small paned windows that gave the light inside a particular quality, slightly gold even on gray days. Above the door, in dark blue paint, she'd chosen and reconsidered and repainted twice until the shade was exactly right. Miren's tea. She stood in front of it for a moment. The sign was good, the window was clean. Through the glass, she could see the shape of the interior, the tables and chairs and the broad shelves waiting along the back wall. Everything exactly as she'd left it, everything in its place. She unlocked the door. The hinges made no sound. She'd attended to that weeks ago. The space opened around her, warm wood, low ceilings, the round tables with their mismatched chairs she'd gathered from a market 2 towns over and a house clearance and an old inn that had closed last spring. The preparation counter clean and waiting. The small hearth with its magical regulation, the one significant sorcery she'd built into the fabric of the place, currently unlit. But she crossed to it, laid her hand against the stone surround and asked it, quietly, to wake. Fire appeared, orange and gold and perfectly calibrated, casting warmth without smoke. She'd spent 3 weeks getting the magical balance exactly right. She would not have described this as excessive. She hung up her coat, she put on her apron, she arranged the things from her basket in their proper places and put the kettle on and turned the small sign in the window from closed to open. She stood behind the counter and waited. The first customer arrived at 7:30. Captain Iris Vance, Harbourmaster, walked through the door with the certainty of someone who walked into situations as though she'd already arranged them. She wore her usual practical gray coat, her short gray hair still carrying the salt of an early morning on the docks, and she looked around the shop with the measuring assessment of someone evaluating seaworthiness. "Good," she said, apparently to the shop in general. She settled into one of the front chairs without being asked, as though she'd been planning to do this for some time. "You've finally opened." 3 weeks late, according to my original estimate, Miren said. 3 weeks early, according to any sensible timeline for a person setting up a business from nothing. Captain Iris accepted the menu Miren had printed on good cream paper and examined it with the focus she gave shipping manifests. "Most people in your position retire to rest. You're retiring to begin." "At my age," Miren said, feeling her way through the sentence with the same care she used measuring herbs, "beginning and ending look remarkably similar." The captain looked up with an expression that suggested she had opinions about this and the restraint not to fully voice them. "I'll have the Dawn blend, and whatever you think should come with it." This was, Miren recognized, a question disguised as an order, and she felt something settle in her chest. The familiar satisfaction of a problem she knew how to solve. She put the kettle on, found the small plate of shortbread she'd baked the evening before and wouldn't admit to anyone she'd baked specifically for this eventuality, and by the time she'd arranged everything on a tray, she felt almost herself again. Captain Iris stayed for an hour. She talked about the harbor in the comfortable, thorough way of someone who loves their work. A shipment of enchanted rope expected from the northern suppliers. A new docking arrangement for the winter months, the way the seasonal tides were running slightly unusual this year. She did not ask personal questions. When she left, She pressed the cost of the tea into Miren's hand without fuss and said, "I'll send anyone I can think of," with the air of someone making a practical logistics arrangement. 3 more customers came and went through the late morning. A man from the candle shop wanting something to help him concentrate. A young woman leaving town in a week who wanted something to carry with her. An older couple who simply wanted somewhere to sit together and watch the sea through the window, who ordered 1 pot of anything and said very little and seemed, by the time they left, to have said everything they needed. Miren served each of them. She talked when it seemed wanted, stayed quiet when it didn't. She was, she discovered, good at this. Perhaps this had been obvious for years, and she was simply the last to realize it. She was partway through restocking the front shelf. Jar of lemon verbena, jar of chamomile, the particular blend she called evening patience for reasons she'd never written down, when the door opened again. Something about the footsteps made her look up, unhurried but purposeful, the sound of someone who'd been thinking about where they were going and had decided in favor of it. The woman who'd come in was perhaps a few years older than Miren. It was difficult to say precisely, and Miren had spent enough of her professional life reading people to know that age wore differently on different faces. This woman had short silver hair that was overdue for a trim and a cardigan the color of old leaves, rust, and amber, with several pockets that appeared to be full of small things. Silver-rimmed glasses had slid most of the way down her nose in a way she seemed to have stopped noticing. She carried a notebook under one arm and looked around the shop with the expression of someone who finds the world genuinely worth examining. She almost walked directly into the nearest table. She noticed it at the last possible second, adjusted without embarrassment, found the closest chair, and sat down in it as though she decided she lived here now. She opened her notebook. She clicked her pen twice in the particular way of someone who thinks by clicking. "I'm from the archive," she said when Miren approached. "Town records. I document new businesses for the community history." A pause, and then, with the air of someone who has just noticed they should have led differently, "I should have arranged this properly, sent a note ahead. I've been meaning to come since you opened, only I thought you'd opened 3 weeks ago and then you hadn't, and then, apparently, you had." She stopped herself and seemed to notice her glasses had slid even further and pushed them up with one ink-stained finger. "I'm Sage, town archivist. I document things, people's stories mostly, so they're remembered." "I gathered," Miren said. Something in her chest was doing something quiet and unexpected, like a sound at the edge of hearing that she wasn't certain she'd caught correctly. She folded her hands in the familiar professional arrangement and said, "I'm Miren. What would you like?" "Tea," said Sage immediately, and then paused. "I don't know what kind. Something for thinking, perhaps. I've been trying to write up the maritime records from the last decade, and they keep—" She made a gesture that managed to convey both papers going everywhere and the fundamental intractability of administrative work. Something for prolonged thinking, stubborn thinking. Miren looked at her for a moment, at the ink on her fingers, the quality of careful attention in her eyes, the way she already held her pen poised over the notebook page as though something worth noting might happen at any moment. "Clarity blend," she said. "Lemon verbena, green tea, and a little sage." She paused. "If that's not too on the nose." The archivist looked up. Something moved through her expression, not quite a smile yet, but the blueprint of one. "I've been told the name was wishful thinking on my parents' part," she said. "It probably suits me better as a tea ingredient than as a personal quality." Miren made the tea. She found herself moving through the familiar motions with a precision that had somehow become performance, not dishonestly, but in the way that the presence of a particular kind of attention makes you more aware of what you're doing. The sound of a pen moving across paper behind her was steady and considered. She set the tea down. Sage thanked her without looking up from her notebook, and then looked up, and then looked at the tea and said in a slightly rueful voice, "I'm going to forget to drink this, aren't I?" "Very likely," Miren said. "I'll bring you another one when you do." Sage looked at her then. A full, clear look, the kind of attention that felt less like judgment than genuine recognition of something. She said, "I record people's stories because someone should remember them, even the ones that look, on the surface, like they've already ended." Miren thought about the single chair at her kitchen table, the plate in the dish rack, the books arranged alphabetically on the shelf, and the other books tucked behind them. "Stories have an ending," she said, and surprised herself a little with the directness of it. "I'm just filling time until mine does." Sage pushed her glasses up. In the autumn light coming through the window, the lenses caught a small, bright glare. She was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone choosing words with some care. "The best archivists," she said, with the measured delivery of a person sharing something they've actually thought about, rather than something they've reached for, "know that every ending is a beginning in disguise, even the ones that come late." Another pause, small and considered. "Especially those." Miren didn't answer. She went back to the counter and stood with her hands flat against the wood, feeling the solidity of it, the grain of old timber, the warmth emanating from the hearth, the steady scrape of a pen beginning to write. Through the window, the harbor moved in its slow autumn way. The maple's amber edges were catching what little sun the morning had managed. The lighthouse stood patient and quiet, its work done until dark. She picked up the kettle and put it back on the heat. The second cup, she already knew, would go cold too. She was already planning the third.